Some updates this morning. This is something that we reported over the weekend, but now NBC News is also reporting. They say they have 3 law enforcement sources who are emphasizing that the case has not gone cold, which is also what sources have been telling me. Someone said it might be chilling, but has not gone cold. Whatever, I don't know, whichever you want to read into that. So the hope is that there's a lot we don't know that's happening behind the scenes right now. There was kind of some drama yesterday. There was these women that showed up like searchers, and they had a shovel, and they started like digging in the ground here in this area. Like, I don't really know what they were doing, but anyway, I think that's why the sheriff's deputies ended up getting called out here. So there's been some kind of characters that have shown up. But most people have really good intentions. A lot of the neighbors are just so upset because they've known Nancy for so long. So I got a couple of things I'm going to work on today, and I'll update you guys later. But I just wanted to check in, and we may get an update later from the sheriff's office. So I'll keep you guys posted.
What if the desert wasn't silent, but waiting? Because deep in the Arizona foothills, something has just changed in a case that investigators thought had gone cold. And now, the man at the center of the reporting, journalist Brian Entin, is standing closer than ever to a discovery that could completely reshape everything we thought we knew about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. A signal lost at exactly 2:28 a.m., a home that went dark in seconds, and a desert that, for months, gave nothing back. Until now. Because FBI ground teams have returned to the Catalina foothills with advanced scanning equipment, and what they've reportedly found is not just a clue, but a pattern of intentional concealment buried beneath the soil. A tactical hiding place, a signal jamming device, and a trail of evidence that suggests this was never random, but calculated. But here's the part that changes everything. The latest discovery wasn't found in the open. It was hidden in a place you would only know if you were already watching, already waiting, or already involved. And as Brian Entin reacts from the field, one chilling question now hangs over the entire investigation. Was the desert hiding evidence, or was someone using the desert to hide in plain sight? Because if these new findings are real, then the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie is no longer just a missing persons case. It may be something far more deliberate, something staged, something still unfolding, right now. And what investigators uncover next in the sand could be the moment everything breaks open. The desert doesn't usually give answers. Here's it erases them. That's what investigators have always said about the Catalina foothills in Arizona, an endless stretch of heat, rock, and silence where time seems to disappear into the sand. But in the case of Nancy Guthrie, that silence has started to feel less like nature and more like something intentional, something arranged. And as new reporting emerges from investigative journalist Brian Entin, the case is no longer being viewed as a simple disappearance. It's being re-examined as something far more precise, a sequence, a system, a moment in time that was carefully controlled down to the second. Because everything begins at exactly 2:28 a.m. That is the moment the digital world around Nancy Guthrie stopped responding. No movement, no signal, no communication, just sudden silence. And in modern investigations, a silence is never just absence, it is data. On the surface, the Guthrie residence was described as secure. A modern home, layered with smart systems, motion detection, cloud-connected surveillance, and internal monitoring designed to record every movement. Nothing about it should have simply failed. Yet at 2:28 a.m., everything did. The house went dark digitally in a way that didn't match normal technical malfunction. Security feeds stopped. Internal devices disconnected. And even more disturbing, medical monitoring tied to Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker abruptly lost contact. That detail alone changed the direction of the entire case. Because while systems can fail, they don't usually fail everywhere at once. Not unless something forces them to. And that possibility immediately pushed investigators into a darker interpretation. This was not a collapse of technology. It was a removal of it, a deliberate blackout. When the initial call came in, responders didn't treat it like a coordinated cyber disruption. At first, it was filed like many missing person cases are filed in their earliest hours. Uncertain, incomplete, possibly accidental. Maybe she left. Maybe she wandered. Maybe there was a medical emergency that simply wasn't witnessed. But even in those early moments, something didn't sit right. The timing was too clean, the absence too complete, and the lack of immediate physical evidence inside the home created a vacuum that quickly filled with speculation. What investigators didn't realize then was that the most important evidence was not inside the house at all, and it was already outside, waiting. Within days, journalist Brian Entin arrived in the region, covering the growing mystery as it shifted from local concern to national attention. From the beginning, Entin's reporting highlighted something unusual. This case was not behaving like a typical disappearance. There were no immediate leads, no obvious suspect, no clear entry or exit pattern that made sense under standard investigative logic. Instead, there was fragmentation. Pieces of information that didn't connect cleanly. A timeline that kept breaking apart under scrutiny. And a location, the Catalina foothills, that seemed to swallow every explanation investigators tried to build. Entin's presence in the field added pressure to an already strained investigation, because what he was documenting was not just what authorities knew, but what they didn't understand yet. And in missing persons cases, uncertainty is often the most dangerous condition of all. Search teams initially focused on the immediate perimeter around the home. Standard procedure. Expand outward in increasing circles. Check roads. Check trails. Check drainage paths. But the desert didn't cooperate. No footprints that held long enough. No obvious drag marks. No abandoned personal items. Even aerial scans showed very little that could anchor the investigation. It was as if the environment itself had been reset, wiped clean. And that is when a troubling possibility began to circulate among analysts. The terrain was not just passive. It may have been used, because deserts don't erase everything equally. Some things remain, unless they are intentionally removed. As forensic teams dug deeper into the technical timeline, they noticed something critical. The loss of signal at 2:28 a.m. was not isolated to one device. It was systemic. Multiple devices failed at the same moment. Security feeds, internal smart systems, external network connections, and the pacemaker signal, all collapsing in near-perfect synchronization. This kind of failure pattern is extremely rare in natural conditions, which led investigators to a chilling early hypothesis. Something actively interrupted the environment, not just physically, but electronically. A kind of controlled silence. A blackout designed not just to hide movement, but to erase it. Once the anomaly became clear, search operations shifted beyond the home and into the surrounding Catalina foothills. And this terrain is difficult even under normal conditions. Rocky elevations, hidden washes, narrow paths that wind through areas inaccessible to most vehicles. But what makes it especially dangerous for investigators is how easy it is to disappear within it. From above, much of it looks uniform. From ground level, it becomes a maze, and in that maze, the FBI began widening their search pattern. Using advanced scanning tools, including ground-penetrating radar systems, teams started analyzing areas that had previously been considered low priority. And that decision changed the trajectory of the case, because what they found next was not accidental. About 4.5 miles from the Guthrie residence, near a secluded stream bed hidden behind a rock formation, investigators identified something unusual beneath the surface. Not a body, and not clothing, not a single clear object, but a disruption. Soil patterns that did not match natural erosion. Layers that appeared disturbed, then partially recovered. And in those layers, small fragments that suggested human presence. Black tactical tape, irregular debris placement, and environmental inconsistencies that implied intentional concealment. This was not a natural formation. It was something altered, something staged. And according to early field interpretations shared through reporting tied to Brian Entin, the significance of this discovery was immediate. This location had been chosen, not stumbled upon. Chosen. Once evidence of deliberate interference entered the picture, the entire case narrative began to shift. Because a missing persons case assumes randomness at some level. A moment of crisis, a gap in awareness, a situation that spiraled out of control. But what investigators were now observing suggested something else entirely. Control, planning, and timing. The idea forming among analysts was simple, but deeply unsettling. If someone had the ability to shut down communication systems at exactly 2:28 a.m., then they also had the ability to control the window of disappearance. And if they controlled the window, they controlled everything inside it. As the investigation progressed, one of the most critical breakthroughs came from a recovered device, a signal jamming unit. Small, portable, highly illegal under federal law, but extremely effective. This device was capable of disrupting Wi-Fi networks, cellular communication, and even connected security systems within a defined radius. In practical terms, it created a digital dead zone. And that dead zone matched the exact timing of the blackout at the Guthrie residence, which transformed the entire understanding of the case. Because this was no longer a mystery of disappearance. It was a controlled shutdown, a deliberate interruption of visibility. And once visibility is removed, anything can happen without record. Among the early forensic notes was another detail that seemed minor at first, but became increasingly significant. The back door of the residence. It was found slightly ajar, not forced open. Not broken, just manipulated, propped, subtly adjusted. And in the context of a signal-jammed environment, that detail becomes critical. Because without functioning cameras or alerts, even small movements go unrecorded, meaning the entry and exit points of the residence cannot be reliably reconstructed from digital evidence alone. They must be inferred from physical traces. And those traces were limited, which deepened the uncertainty. As Brian Entin continued reporting from the field, public interest surged. Social media discussions exploded with theories. Was this a targeted abduction? Was it an opportunistic crime? Was it an internal family misunderstanding taken too far? Or was it something more structured? Something involving planning and surveillance. But beneath all speculation, one fact remained unchanged. Nancy Guthrie had vanished under conditions that did not align with chance, and the desert, instead of revealing answers, was now revealing patterns. Patterns that suggested preparation. And by the end of the early investigation phase, one question had risen above all others. Not, where is Nancy Guthrie? But this, who had the ability to make an entire modern home go silent in under a second? And why? Because if the answer to that question is ever fully understood, then the rest of the case will no longer be about searching. It will be about pursuit. And in the Catalina foothills, where visibility disappears into rock and heat, pursuit becomes something far more dangerous than search. It becomes confrontation. And that confrontation is only just beginning. By the time federal investigators returned to the Catalina foothills, the case of Nancy Guthrie had already shifted into a different category. It was no longer being treated as a routine missing person investigation. It was now being handled as a complex, multi-layer disappearance with suspected technical interference. And that single change, quiet, procedural, almost invisible to the public, was enough to transform everything. Because once a case enters that category, every assumption gets re-evaluated. Every timeline gets rebuilt. And every piece of ground already searched gets searched again. This is where journalist Brian Entin re-enters the field narrative in a way that changes the tone of public understanding. Not as a commentator anymore, but as someone documenting a case that is actively evolving in real time. And what he reports from the ground in Arizona is simple, but deeply unsettling. The desert is no longer quiet. It is reacting. After the discovery of disturbed soil patterns and tactical materials in Chapter 1, FBI field units expanded their operation radius. The new focus was not the immediate residents anymore. It was the surrounding geography, roads, washes, blind ridges, and hidden stream beds that could act as natural concealment corridors. The Catalina foothills, once treated as a backdrop, were now being treated like a system of pathways, not random terrain, but a network. And in investigative terms, that changes everything, because networks imply movement, and movement implies planning. Early in the case, investigators asked, where did Nancy go? Then, did she leave the home willingly? Then, was there a struggle? But now, a more dangerous question emerged. Was the environment prepared in advance? That question immediately introduces intent. And intent changes classification. Because intent removes randomness. And without randomness, the disappearance becomes structured, which means someone designed it. The location identified 4.5 miles from the Guthrie residence became the focal point of renewed investigation. This was not a large open field. It was a concealed stream bed, hidden behind layered rock formations that naturally break sightlines from above. Even helicopters passing overhead would struggle to detect anything unusual below, which is exactly why the FBI now believed it may have been chosen deliberately. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed again, this time with tighter scan intervals, more precise calibration, slower coverage, and within hours the same anomalies appeared again. Disturbed soil layers, non-natural compaction, and subtle structural inconsistencies beneath the surface. But what made this phase different was not just what they found, it was what they began to connect. Fragments of black tactical tape recovered in earlier sweeps were now re-examined in context. At first, they seemed random, but under forensic grouping analysis, a pattern emerged. The distribution of fragments was not scattered. It was directional, almost as if something had been marked or deliberately left behind at intervals. This shifted interpretation from accidental debris to intentional placement or staged discard. And according to field reporting referenced by Brian Entin, this was one of the earliest moments where investigators stopped treating the scene as passive evidence and started treating it as constructed evidence. That distinction is critical, because constructed evidence implies awareness of investigation tactics. It implies anticipation. It implies counter-investigation behavior. The recovered electronic device, previously identified as a signal jammer, was now fully analyzed by federal cyber units. What they confirmed escalated the case further. The device was not basic. It was high-powered, capable of disrupting multiple communication layers simultaneously. Cellular signals, Wi-Fi networks, smart home systems, Bluetooth-linked devices, and, most critically, it created a temporary communication blackout zone with a radius large enough to affect nearby residences. That meant the impact was not isolated to the Guthrie home. It may have extended outward into the surrounding neighborhood. This detail changed the scope of the crime. Because now, it wasn't just about entering a home undetected. It was about controlling the entire digital environment during a critical window of time. Investigators reconstructed the timeline repeatedly. Every version returned to the same anchor point, 2:28 a.m. That moment remained the system-wide failure threshold. But now, with the jammer confirmed, analysts began layering events: device activation, window network disruption, onset, security system, collapse, medical signal loss. All converging within seconds of each other. This synchronization was not random. It was engineered, and engineering implies preparation, which led investigators to a disturbing realization. Whoever did this knew exactly how long they needed silence. Not minutes, not hours, but seconds. Just enough to execute movement without digital record. The back door of the residence, previously noted as slightly ajar, was re-examined under new context. At first glance, it had seemed like a minor anomaly. But in a blackout environment, small physical actions become disproportionately significant. Investigators now believe the door was not forced. It was controlled, adjusted, possibly used as a quiet entry or exit point during the communication blackout window. And if that interpretation is correct, it suggests one thing. The perpetrator was inside the property during the blackout window. Not outside observing, not guessing, but actively moving within the environment while systems were disabled. One of the most chilling findings came from terrain analysis. A hillside ridge overlooking the property line was identified as a potential vantage point. From that elevation, the backyard is partially visible. Movement patterns can be observed. Entry and exit routes become predictable. In tactical terms, this is known as a surveillance advantage point. It allows continuous observation without proximity. And according to field commentary associated with Brian Entin, this discovery shifted investigator mindset again. Because now the question wasn't just how someone entered the home, it was, how long had they been watching it? Once the vantage point was identified, analysts began reviewing the timeline from a different angle. Instead of focusing only on the night of disappearance, they expanded outward. Days before. Weeks before patterns of observation. Environmental familiarity. And the more they looked, the more a pattern emerged. The suspect, if one existed, did not behave like someone improvising. They behaved like someone familiar with the environment, which introduces two possibilities. The location was studied in advance. The location was known already. Both possibilities carry serious implications, because familiarity suggests preparation, and preparation suggests intent. As federal involvement deepened, tension grew between agencies and local law enforcement. The FBI focused heavily on digital forensics, terrain mapping, and electronic analysis. Local authorities emphasized physical search grids and witness interviews. This split created two parallel interpretations of the same case, one technical, one procedural. And according to reporting from Brian Entin, this divergence became one of the most significant friction points in the investigation. Because when agencies disagree on the nature of a crime, progress slows. And in missing person cases, time is the most critical resource. A breakthrough came from an unexpected source: retail surveillance analysis. Investigators identified a series of purchases made in Tucson area stores shortly before the disappearance. Items included hiking gear, tactical tape, a backpack, outdoor boots. Individually, these items are common. Together, they form a functional kit. And that realization changed interpretation again. Because a kit implies purpose, not coincidence. Analysts began to form a theory. The suspect may have deliberately chosen mass-market products. Why? Because mass-market products are difficult to trace. They blend into thousands of identical purchases. They leave minimal unique identifiers. In forensic terms, this is known as disposable anonymity. Use once, discard afterward, and in this case, potentially, use during the event, then abandon in a controlled environment, such as the desert stream bed. Even with physical evidence emerging, one major question remained unresolved. Why was there no digital trace? No clear device location logs? No consistent surveillance capture? No reliable geolocation trail? This led investigators back to the jammer theory, because if communication systems were disabled at the right moment, digital tracking becomes unreliable. And without digital tracking, physical movement becomes harder to reconstruct. And which means whoever orchestrated this understood one critical fact. Modern investigations rely heavily on digital continuity. Remove continuity, and you remove clarity. By the end of this phase, the investigation had shifted dramatically, from disappearance to disruption, to controlled environment failure, to structured concealment, and now to something even more complex: a planned event operating under temporary invisibility. And that invisibility window, created at exactly 2:28 a.m., became the central focus of every analyst working the case. Because within that window, something happened, something precise, something efficient, something that left almost no digital footprint, but did leave physical echoes in the desert. As Brian Entin continues reporting from Arizona, one theme becomes unavoidable. The desert is not just a backdrop anymore. It is part of the investigation. And it may be holding the structure of what happened, because every new discovery points to the same conclusion. Nothing about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie appears accidental. Not the timing, not the location, not the tools, and certainly not the silence. And as investigators prepare to expand even further into the foothills, one question now dominates every briefing room. If the desert was used to hide what happened, what else is still buried beneath it? By the time the investigation entered its third major phase, the case of Nancy Guthrie had stopped behaving like a missing persons file entirely. It was now something else, something layered, something reactive, something that seemed to shift every time investigators got closer to a stable conclusion. And at the center of the public narrative, continuing to document each development from the field, was journalist Brian Entin, whose reporting had become one of the most consistent windows into how rapidly the case was evolving. But even for someone experienced in covering complex investigations, what was unfolding in Arizona was beginning to feel different. Not just difficult, but deliberately obscured, as if the case itself was resisting resolution. After the discovery of the signal jammer, the tactical debris field, and the disturbed streambed site, investigators expected the next phase to bring clarity. Instead, it brought contradiction. Two competing realities began forming simultaneously. One version of the case suggested a highly organized abduction with technical suppression. The other suggested misinformation, noise, and opportunistic interference. And both interpretations were being supported by different fragments of evidence. This is where investigations often become unstable, when evidence does not converge, but splits. And that splitting creates something dangerous. Confusion that looks like complexity, but is actually fragmentation. One of the most disturbing developments came from a series of messages sent to media outlets. Some claimed Nancy Guthrie was alive. Others claimed she had been moved across the border. Others contradicted both entirely. At first, investigators dismissed them as noise. But as more messages appeared, a pattern emerged. And they were not consistent, but they were directional. Each one seemed designed to push attention southward, toward Sonora, toward the border region, toward uncertainty. And according to field reporting tied to Brian Entin, this raised a new concern among analysts. These messages were not informative. They were manipulative, which introduces a new layer to the investigation: psychological interference. As contradictory reports circulated, one theory gained traction among external analysts: that Nancy Guthrie may have been moved across the border into Mexico. This idea was based on 3 points: terrain familiarity with desert wash routes, lack of digital tracking at known crossing points, timing alignment with the communication blackout. But the FBI approach remained cautious, because in missing persons cases, border theories often emerge early and are frequently misleading. However, in this case, something made this theory harder to dismiss entirely: the precision of the initial disappearance. If someone had control of communication systems at the exact moment of disappearance, then controlling movement pathways becomes significantly easier. And in that scenario, border proximity becomes strategically relevant. Not definitive, but possible. Despite extensive cyber forensic analysis, investigators still faced a critical problem. There was no continuous digital trail, no consistent GPS data, no stable cellular movement path, no verified device handshake after 2:28 a.m., and that absence remained the most important feature of the case. Because in modern investigations, absence of data is rarely natural. It usually indicates interference, which brings the investigation back to the recovered jammer device. Federal analysts confirmed that the device could create a temporary but complete communication blackout zone. And in that zone, digital systems do not just fail. They stop recording entirely, which means anything that happens inside that window is effectively invisible. Investigators expanded their retail surveillance review, and what they found began to tighten the timeline in a troubling way. A series of purchases had been made in Tucson area retail locations shortly before the disappearance. The items were not suspicious individually, but together they formed a pattern. Outdoor hiking boots, tactical-grade tape, a medium-capacity backpack, standard survival gear components. Nothing illegal, nothing restricted. But collectively, they formed what investigators described as a temporary operational kit. A kit that could be assembled quickly, used once, and discarded, which aligned with the materials later recovered in the desert. This raised a critical possibility. The gear was not personal, it was functional. As evidence accumulated, one question began dominating internal discussions. Whoever orchestrated this, what level of experience did they have? Because several elements did not match opportunistic behavior. Controlled digital blackout, terrain-based concealment strategy, deliberate discard of traceable items, timing precision at the second level, environmental familiarity with blind zones. These are not random characteristics. They suggest planning. But more importantly, they suggest understanding of investigative response patterns. And that introduces a new possibility. The suspect may not only have planned the event, they may have anticipated the investigation. One of the most significant developments came from terrain mapping. The hillside overlooking the Guthrie property was reassessed using elevation modeling and line-of-sight analysis. The conclusion was clear. From that vantage point, a person could observe entry points of the home backyard movement patterns, vehicle presence and absence cycles, lighting changes during nighttime hours. This was not incidental visibility. It was strategic observation range. And according to field reporting associated with Brian Entin, this shifted internal investigative thinking again. Because now, the focus was no longer just on the night of disappearance. It was on everything that came before it. The investigators began examining whether the home had been observed prior to the incident. This included vehicle traffic patterns in surrounding roads, repeated presence of unknown individuals in the area, environmental familiarity indicators, any prior minor disturbances or anomalies. While no definitive pre-incident surveillance confirmation was made public, analysts noted that the tactical precision of the event strongly implied prior knowledge of home layout security system structure, response timing delays, blind spots in coverage. This raised a critical implication. The perpetrator did not operate blind. They operated informed. Federal cyber units completed a more detailed breakdown of the signal jamming device. What they confirmed intensified the investigation. Multi-frequency disruption capability, range expansion beyond initial estimates, compatibility with smart home ecosystems, ability to interrupt emergency communication signals. This was not a basic off-the-shelf device. It was highly capable, and its activation timing aligned almost perfectly with the system-wide blackout event, which reinforced one central conclusion. The blackout was not incidental. It was engineered, and engineered blackouts imply intent to control perception. Because when systems cannot observe, events cannot be recorded. As physical evidence accumulated, investigators began referring informally to a central concept, the digital ghost. This refers to an individual who operates without consistent electronic presence, avoids traceable device usage, exploits communication, blind windows, uses environmental suppression tools, and, most importantly, leaves physical traces without leaving digital continuity. In Nancy Guthrie's case, this concept fit multiple observed anomalies. But it also raised a deeper question. How long had this capability been prepared? Because systems like this are not improvised quickly. They are tested, refined, rehearsed. At this stage, investigators were no longer dealing with a simple missing person trajectory, and they were dealing with a layered event structure involving environmental control, communication suppression, misleading information flows, physical evidence, staging, possible cross-border displacement, and each layer added complexity, but also intention. And intention is what transforms a case from chaotic to structured, which is why analysts began to describe the situation in a new way, not as a disappearance, but as a managed absence. Throughout this phase, Brian Entin continued reporting from Arizona, emphasizing a consistent theme. Every time investigators uncover a new layer, the case becomes more structured, not less. This is unusual in missing persons investigations, because typically more evidence leads to simplification. But here, it led to expansion, and expansion suggests design. Kenton's reporting helped frame the growing public understanding that this was not a static case. It was an evolving one, still actively developing, still actively producing new variables. Despite caution from law enforcement, the Sonora theory continued to circulate. Not because it was confirmed, but because it could not be fully eliminated. The absence of border surveillance hits, combined with terrain accessibility routes, left open theoretical pathways for movement. However, investigators emphasized one critical limitation. No physical confirmation existed, no verified crossing evidence, no confirmed witness account, which meant the theory remained exactly that, a theory. But in high-complexity investigations, even unproven theories shape resource allocation, and that alone affects the direction of search efforts. By the end of this phase, the investigation had evolved into something far more complex than a disappearance. It had become a system of interacting variables: digital suppression, physical evidence staging, behavioral pattern reconstruction, terrain-based analysis, psychological misdirection. And within that system, every new discovery no longer answered questions. It generated new ones, and at the center of it all remained the same unresolved truth. Nancy Guthrie had vanished inside a window of engineered silence, and that silence, once thought to be empty, is now revealing structure, which leads into the final phase of the investigation, where evidence stops suggesting theory and begins pointing toward identification. By the time the investigation reached its final and most critical phase, something had fundamentally changed in the case of Nancy Guthrie. What began as a disappearance had evolved into a fully constructed investigative puzzle. Every layer uncovered in the Catalina foothills had revealed not randomness, but structure, not chaos, but design. And now, as federal agencies intensified their final sweep of evidence, the pressure reached its highest point yet. At the center of public attention remained journalist Brian Entin, whose field updates had become one of the most consistent real-time narratives of a case that refused to stabilize. But even his reporting began to reflect a shift, because the question was no longer just what happened. It was now, who could have done this, and how close are we to identifying them? After weeks of layered investigation, digital suppression analysis, terrain mapping, forensic debris collection, and behavioral reconstruction, the FBI began consolidating its findings into a single working theory, and that theory was becoming increasingly specific. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie was no longer being treated as an open-ended mystery. It was being treated as a controlled, time-bound operation executed within a narrow communication blackout window. That window, centered at 2:28 a.m., remained the most critical anchor point in the entire timeline, because everything that followed depended on it. One of the most important developments came from forensic genetic analysis. Inside the recovered items, particularly the tactical boot and fragments of material from the desert site, investigators identified trace biological material, not enough for immediate identification, but enough to build a profile. And this is where modern forensic science changes everything, because even when DNA does not match existing criminal databases, it can still be used to reconstruct identity pathways through investigative genetic genealogy. This technique allows analysts to trace familial connections using public genetic databases and build probabilistic family trees. And according to investigative updates referenced in field reporting associated with Brian Entin, this process had already begun, quietly, methodically, without public announcement, because once genetic genealogy begins, cases often shift from speculation to identification pathways. As analysts combine physical evidence, terrain behavior, and digital suppression patterns, a psychological profile began forming, not of a random offender, but of a structured thinker. Key behavioral indicators included high familiarity with surveillance systems, understanding of communication network, vulnerabilities, awareness of law enforcement response timelines, ability to operate within terrain-based concealment zones, strategic use of disposable retail materials, strong emphasis on digital invisibility. This combination is rare because it suggests not just planning, but systems awareness. In simpler terms, the suspect understood how modern investigations work and how to temporarily disable them. The recovered signal jamming device remained one of the most critical pieces of evidence. Federal cyber units confirmed it was capable of creating a multi-layer blackout environment, to disrupting cellular communication, Wi-Fi networks, smart home connectivity, GPS-linked devices, emergency signal transmission. But the most important finding was not capability. It was timing. The device's activation window matched the exact collapse of all digital systems at the Guthrie residence, which confirmed what investigators had begun to suspect. This was not incidental interference. It was synchronized suppression. And synchronization implies coordination. As investigators returned again to the Catalina foothills for final mapping runs, something subtle began to emerge. The terrain itself was no longer being viewed as passive geography. It was now being treated as a designed operational space, because every key discovery aligned along a pattern. Entry suppression at the residence, movement concealment, through washes, evidence discard in hidden stream beds, observation, vantage points on elevated ridges. When mapped together, these elements formed a structure, a movement corridor, a controlled path through terrain designed to avoid visibility. And according to analysis tied to Brian Entin, this realization reframed everything. The desert was not just where the crime happened. It was part of how it was executed. The retail purchase investigation, once considered secondary, now became more significant. Surveillance and transaction analysis suggested that items purchased shortly before the disappearance aligned directly with materials recovered in the desert. This included tactical tape, hiking gear, outdoor footwear, a medium-capacity backpack. What changed the interpretation was not the items themselves, but their coordination. They were not random purchases. They were a single-use operational set, designed for temporary deployment and disposal, which aligned with the theory of a controlled event window. Use, then erase. At this stage, investigators were working with two primary interpretations. One, localized control theory. The suspect operated entirely within the Arizona terrain, using knowledge of foothills, blind zones, and suppression technology to execute and conceal the event. 2. Transition theory. The suspect used the desert environment as a staging corridor to move beyond the region, potentially toward border-adjacent territory. Neither theory had full confirmation, but both were now considered operational possibilities, and that ambiguity meant resources were being split between domestic and cross-regional analysis teams. As all evidence converged, one question became central. Not where did Nancy go, but how was she made invisible? Because invisibility in this case was not metaphorical. It was technical. It was environmental. It was engineered. And once investigators accepted that invisibility had been created deliberately, the case transformed again, from disappearance to construction. In one of the most widely circulated updates from the field, Brian Entin summarized the emotional and investigative tensions surrounding the case. Every new piece of evidence, instead of simplifying the story, made it more precise. And precision suggests design. Design suggests intention. And intention suggests accountability. This is where the investigation reaches its most dangerous point. Because once a case moves from what happened to who designed it, it becomes personal. And personal cases are the hardest to close. As genetic genealogy analysis progressed, investigators began narrowing down familial clusters connected to recovered DNA fragments. No public identification was released, but internal sources indicated that the profile was becoming increasingly refined. Each iteration removed uncertainty. Each comparison reduced possibilities. And each reduction brought the investigation closer to a tangible identity range. This is the moment in many cases where silence breaks, not suddenly, but structurally, piece by piece, until one connection finally holds. In the final segment of reporting, the Catalina foothills are no longer described as simply a search zone. They are described as a map of decisions. Every ridge, every wash, every concealed point now represents a potential action window. And as the sun sets over the Arizona horizon, the emotional tone of the investigation shifts. Because, for the first time, there is a sense, not of conclusion, but of proximity. Something is close, not fully revealed, but no longer hidden in the same way. The disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has not yet been resolved. No official suspect has been publicly confirmed. No final arrest has been made. But something irreversible has happened. The silence that once defined this case is no longer absolute. It has been mapped. It has been analyzed. It has been structured. And in that structure, the investigators now see something they did not see at the beginning: a path forward. Because every fragment recovered from the desert, the jammer, the tactical tape, the boot, the disturbed soil, has begun to form a direction. And direction means movement. And movement means the case is still alive, still active, still unfolding. And somewhere within that unfolding truth is the answer everyone has been searching for. Not just what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but who built the silence that made it possible.